US wants to, control the natural resources of countries like Bolivia and Venezuela for their own benefit, to extract these resources, not to have any partnerships about developing the country, industrializing the economy. And that's completely different to what China's done.
Hi, this is the Ignoramus's Guide to Surviving Humanity. I'm Ileana Chan. This is my co-host, Wei Chan. I should have let you say your name. And we're here with Fiona Edwards, a journalist and activist, and a signatory for the No Cold War campaign, which has just launched a British chapter about in the middle of June. So thank you so much for joining us and coming here and enlightening us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you both.
Yay, so let's dig into, I guess, the first thing, which would be, what is the No Cold War campaign?
Well, we launched this international campaign called No Cold War last July, in July 2020, and this was in response to what was the increasing aggression towards China from the United States, which from a trade war, military encirclement, and the people that launched this campaign, the signatories that launched this campaign, said this constitutes a threat to all humanity. So we've got together an international campaign to say, rather than this aggression from the United States against China, which is sort of basically a new Cold War, we need to step back from this situation and have global cooperation and peace. So that's what inspired people to come together to launch an international campaign last year.
So for people who might be like, what the heck are you talking about? There's a Cold War with China. How would you sort of make them see that because most people, I just came back from the US. And so a lot of people in the US might just think, well, China's kind of a scary country. And they're out to get us.
Yeah, I mean, this is a result of huge propaganda offensive by the United States mainstream media and politicians, which is actually creating a false idea that China is a threat, when nothing further from the truth. I mean, if you just take the military situation, which the US has been building up a really large military presence in the Pacific region against China for many years now, and you now have 400 military bases that surround China. There's like over 700 billion pounds being spent, dollars being spent every year on the US military. This is increasingly being targeted on weapons targeting China, and US warships regularly roam around, the South China Sea, the Pacific region. This is very threatening. China has no military bases surrounding the United States. You don't see warships from Beijing going along the coastline of California. So it's creating a media narrative that China is some sort of threat. This is based a lot on conspiracy theories, demonization of China, and it's not true. And actually what's really the threat to people of the US and people of Britain and all across the world is actually this military buildup against China, and also the economic Cold War that's coming along with this as well. The idea that, sanctions, tariffs against China, which are actually designed to try and attack China's economic growth, its development. That's the meaning of these, but it actually backfires. Like this economic Cold War affects jobs in the United States. It affects living standards in the United States. In Britain, we're not having 5G from China, so we're going to get it later, and it's going to be more expensive. So it's very damaging, this Cold War, from an economic point of view. And the most menacing element of all is this military buildup. And in order to justify that, the US and its allies are having to present in the media that China's some big threat, and it just doesn't exist. China is not. China is a potential partner to solve the common problems facing humanity, and that's what at No Cold War we believe in: global cooperation to tackle really serious problems like climate change, like the pandemic, poverty, alleviation across the world. The list goes on of real serious threats that we're facing, and it's definitely not China that is the threat to us.
What about this claim that China is the new imperialist power? Like everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people know of America as an imperialist power. And part of, I think, the propaganda or the narrative in this Cold War is, you know, China is there sort of, if America doesn't continue the imperialism, China is really in place to be an imperial power.
Right, and the Chinese are colonizing Africa or something like that. And what would you, because I heard some of that in sort of the mainstream media sort of years ago, and I just thought, probably, you know. So what do you, why do you think that narrative's been built up, and
is it true?
Do you think it's true?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, this Cold War, like, I mean, it is very much focused on China, but it does affect a lot of developing countries too. Like, there's a Cold War happening in Latin America. I mean, just this week at the UN, the overwhelming majority of countries in the world condemned the blockade of Cuba. This is part of the Cold War. You know, it's attempting to strand Cuba. You've got sanctions against Venezuela and Nicaragua, and the US government explicitly says, you know, that they want to overthrow these governments. That's against international law. For the United States to intervene in countries in Latin America to try and overthrow the governments that are democratically elected, that's an attack on sovereignty, that's an attack on the people's right to self-determination, it's an attack on democracy, it's actually an attack on human rights and economic development, because the people are suffering economically because of these sanctions. So in terms of, if you want to talk about what's happening in the global, what's the experience of Latin America, of Cuba, and other countries in Latin America when it comes to China versus the United States? Well, you've had the United States go, we've got a global pandemic. What a great opportunity to strangle the Venezuelan economy. Let's tighten the sanctions on the oil. Let's try and bring people to the brink of starvation. And what's been the approach of China? It's been sending shipment after shipment after shipment of aid and medical supplies to help deal with the pandemic, which has been essential. They have defied the sanctions from the United States and bought Venezuela's oil. So for people in Venezuela, to say that there's some equivalency here between the United States and China is ludicrous. The idea that this is imperialism, well, since when does imperialism not try and overthrow our government, is the sort of response we'll get from progressive people in Latin America. So it's a very different experience. And it's not just that, but also if you look at Bolivia, another example recently, I mean, there was a coup last year against Evo Morales, which overthrew the government and installed a far-right dictatorship. And one of the motivations for this coup in Bolivia was that Elon Musk at Tesla wanted to get their hands on Bolivia's lithium. He even admitted this on Twitter. And the US wants to, you know, control the natural resources of countries like Bolivia and Venezuela for their own benefit, to extract these resources, not to have any partnerships about developing the country, industrializing the economy. And that's completely different to what China's done. They've entered into, prior to the coup in Bolivia, they were entering into massive agreements with the Bolivian government to help Bolivia develop its own lithium industry, to industrialize, to produce batteries, to produce electric vehicles. And this was what the United States didn't want to see. They want to keep Bolivia in its place, as they would say, just exporting this raw material unprocessed, whereas China is listening to the, well, not interfering in Bolivia and entering in mutually beneficial partnerships. And the Bolivian government say, we want to develop this, let's have a cooperation in terms of investment. China's got a lot of expertise in green industries, and that's a world of difference. So anyone who says there's no difference between the US and China, they're both twin evils, they're both threats, it's just not reality. It's not, and that comes very, very starkly when you look at the situation in Latin America, which is something that I do research a lot on. I mean, the idea doesn't get a hearing. You know, the idea that China is evil, a really imperialist approach into Latin America is just not a serious argument.
That's kind of sort of, you know, what I've been finding out over the last year. And thank you very much for organizing that No Cold War inaugural meeting. I found that really, really informative. And I just feel overwhelmed with how much unlearning and reading that I need to do to understand the interconnectedness of the struggles of countries in the global South. And kind of, I remember like a few years ago, and probably a lot of people in the UK don't really understand much about Latin America, and when you mention the word Venezuela, people start scoffing. It's a common kind of centrist or right-wing talking point to sort of hold up Venezuela as a failure of communism. That's why they're poor, because they are socialist, and there's economic mismanagement and things like that. And also that Maduro is an illegitimately elected or illegitimate kind of government. How do you think the media has been complicit in framing it this way, and do you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, well, I think that the way the mainstream Western media unfortunately doesn't give very accurate line on what happens in Latin America. I mean, Maduro's a democratically elected president in Venezuela. Like, you read articles about Venezuela talking about the economic situation, how difficult it is, and they managed to not mention the word sanctions. How can you do that? How can we take this journalism seriously if you don't mention the words US and sanctions?
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the issue. And, you know, often you read things and you're like, well, that looks very similar to this press release I've just read on the State Department website. You know, it's kind of, you know, it's kind of how it works.
On that point of the media, sorry, I mean, you expect kind of Sky News, Fox News, CNN, and kind of centrist, neoliberal and right-wing media to, you know, to spout these lines and to almost just parrot government talking points or foreign policy talking points. But why does the left-wing media behave so disappointingly? Or because I have not really seen any counter narratives in publications like The Guardian, or if there are less counter narratives, and people talk about kind of the death of the anti-war left, and how we haven't had major opposition, mainstream opposition to war on the left for quite a few years now. Do you agree with that, or do you have any opinions on that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the situation in the world, you know, it's particularly in a country like Britain, in Europe and the US, it is going to the right, and I think that impacts, you know, progressive, what presents itself as progressive media. Although I think, you know, certain publications have got a very dodgy history anyway, like in the past. But I think that you know, for example, the US soft coup in Brazil recently, which culminated in the installation of Bolsonaro, which people know, the far right president of Brazil, who's chopping down the rainforest at record speed, you know, attacking communities there, is responsible for one of the worst coronavirus catastrophes in the entire world, and called the coronavirus just a little flu. You know, he got in power because of the Trump faction in the United States, and this is not, you know, this hasn't been widely publicized and discussed, and it's been the struggle within Brazil now. The Trump took corruption charges against Lula, which led to him being put in prison, even though he was the leading candidate who would have defeated Bolsonaro in the presidential election. Those corruption charges getting squashed by the courts is now leading to a bit more of a discussion internationally. But, you know, I think we have a real issue of different points of view being expressed, and there's a big censorship push when things are moving to the right in the kind of more Western world. And I think, and that this links directly with the Cold War. You know, you see real censorship of different progressive Latin American websites like Telesur on Twitter. The Cuban mainstream, the Cuban media gets attacked. In Britain, we've actually had, you know, CGTN, which is the state broadcaster for China in the English language. They had their license revoked by the British authorities. So, you know, the BBC carries a line, you know, which is, you know, from the British state. China can put out put its own line on its TV stations. You know, are we going to listen to the different points of view or not? I think you're right that there is a bit of an issue of a lack of a voice for progressives, particularly in the West. And I think the trend is actually towards more censorship. So I think with campaigns like No Cold War and what you're here with the podcast, it is really important to put forward an alternative narrative because, they say that the first casualty in any war is the truth. And if you've got this Cold War, you have to realize that there's so much propaganda and false information that's going to be put out there because they want to get as much of the public on board with this as possible. So yeah, I think you're really correct to point that out as a very dangerous situation, not having the real information and the real facts before us.
I think one of the issues too, like we're both Malaysian, Chinese, British, and one of the issues I find being, I guess, in a way, part of the Chinese community is just there seems to be almost a generational divide on this idea of Cold War against China because of the Xinjiang issue and also the Hong Kong protests. There's almost like our parents' generation, they tend to look more, I wouldn't say objectively, but maybe more favorably towards China. And then there tends to be in our generation, maybe like more of the Western line of democracy, freedom of speech, and all these things that without the awareness that it's also being weaponized. So I think we almost veer towards like being so suspicious of China because we don't want to be accused of being pro-China, So it was actually something interesting about watching the No Cold War panel, which we learned so much from. But then when Li Jingjing, I think is her name, when she came on as part of the panel, I think our first instinct was a bit like, why do you have a pro-China propagandist on your panel? Won't that undermine your efforts?
Well, no, I mean, I think one of the key things in this international movement, which is developing, which is just beginning against the Cold War, is that we need to engage with everyone who is against this Cold War. And that obviously includes China. And as a country of 1.4 billion people, I think they have to be part of the conversation. And I think, it's like with the CGTN ban that we had from British authorities. It's like, you don't need to agree with everything that CGTN says or puts forward. Is whether or not you think that should be part of the debate, whether that should be part of the discussion. Like, and it's not just from the point of view of free speech and democracy, but if you have a situation where Britain's sending its largest ever aircraft carrier loaded with US jets, fighter jets and military equipment to a really sensitive region like the South China Sea, and then you're not prepared to even listen to what China's point of view is, that can lead to really dangerous situations. If you've not got accurate information, then that can lead to very serious situations. But I mean, the other issue, so that's one thing, a threat to global, world peace. But then the other issue is, if you take on the situation of the coronavirus, like not listening to China and what they did to very, very quickly deal with the pandemic, to crush the virus. I think they've had less than 5,000 deaths in a country of 1.4 billion, which is way less than what Britain has as a much tinier country. We're not, there is an opportunity to learn from other countries. And I think we have to have the kind of humility to have that discussion and that dialogue. And I think especially with a country like Britain, with its history of, colonization in Hong Kong for 150 years, the words freedom and democracy, human rights in Hong Kong, forget about it. They had none of that. So the idea that, especially as a country as Britain, is in any position to talk about any of these things in relation to China is really ludicrous. But like you said, I mean, the issue of opposing the Cold War is vital, and you don't have to support China. You don't have to be pro-China. On the contrary, diversity of opinions and views. But I think within that, you have to kind of make sure that everyone is represented, and that includes Chinese people who are going to defend their country. And so I think that even if you don't want to agree with what people from China say, listening and engaging in dialogue is really important to get a total view of the situation and to get to the truth. So yeah, so I think that's important. But I mean, I'd be interested to know, your points around the experience of Chinese diaspora communities. Yeah, I think you're much more of an expert on that than myself, of course. So
one of the things that kind of sent me on this journey to recognizing anti-China bias was actually kind of the how illogical I found the media coverage around coronavirus, and where China was simultaneously lying about or covering up the coronavirus and ignoring it, yet doing the biggest, harshest lockdown in history and the quickest lockdown. And also this thing about how they sat on the truth for 6 days, and then and that is there, and therefore that the spread of coronavirus in the States is China's fault, despite the fact that both Trump and Boris denied the severity of coronavirus for a good few weeks. So, I mean, I think if they were given an extra 6 days, I don't really feel that would have made any difference. And then the kind of constant ramping up of just very illogical talking points. For example, China must be lying about their numbers. I mean, they could be, but even if it was doubled, that would still just be 10,000 deaths, you know. They could be lying about it by a scale of sort of, you know, tenfold, and it would still be better than what the UK and the US have done. And I severely doubt that their estimates are out by that much. So yeah, I just think I'm just really, really, really shocked at the media coverage of the whole thing. I can't remember what my original point was now, but
that
yeah.
does lead me to, I have so many questions now about the disinformation that's happening around coronavirus, because I mean, we all want to know the truth, you know, but it's an ongoing discovery, exploration, let's say, but we have to sort of sift through all this propaganda. And I guess one of the things is this like whole, which we kind of did cover, the vaccine diplomacy thing, which like, can we trust the reports that are saying that the Chinese vaccines are less, I don't know if you have any insight into this, that they're less, you know, effective, where this, you know, because there's so much, I guess, Western media coverage saying that, like, oh, you know, China gave all these vaccines to these countries. Why are these countries still affected by COVID? When everyone knows herd immunity is like way more than 50%, but say like that's the whole, so that's kind of the narrative, like that these vaccines were just bullshit, essentially. Do you have any insight into that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, I think the issue on the coronavirus is that a genuine catastrophe has happened in many, many countries. The US, I think they've had over 600,000 people have died. In Britain, it's well over 100,000 people have died. And, you know, I think that is a huge attack on people, you know, because it's the fault of the US government, it's the fault of the British government delaying response to the virus, locking down too late, and, you know, multiple occasions there's been waves and waves of this virus. So you can't say, you know, and they were aware of it before it even arrived on the shores, you know, of the US and Britain, because China did respond very quickly, cooperated with World Health Organization. The very beginning, that you can't ever have a perfect response because this is a new situation, and no one's going to claim that everything was got perfect, but things, you know, were responded to very fast, and then China did show what was needed to crush the virus. So I think there's a huge, you know, if people knew the truth, I mean, of what's happening, you know, China's had less than 5,000 deaths, the US has 600,000 deaths, and that's because in the US profits were put first, and in China saving lives were put first. What impact would this have on the world population and what they think about the world? So that can't be the thing that's allowed to become the known, you know, the narrative. So they're constantly coming in with, you know, loads of attacks trying to obscure that. I mean, and again, the real situation is, you know, the countries like the US and other developed countries are hoarding vaccines. They're not sharing them with the global south, where China has been. No one, you know, it's not the case that vaccines are a magic bullet. I think I certainly don't think that's the sole solution. You need public health measures and such like. But, you know, I think that what you're saying around, you know, the attacks on China's vaccine, it's to distract and to hide from the mistakes that have been made by the US government and others. You know, it's just a distraction, and that's what they're constantly engaging in. We're still living with, you know, this horrific pandemic. It's far from over. Yeah.
What about
I was just going to say, just as an interesting point, I think Bloomberg News maybe a month or two ago did publish an article saying that Sinovac was actually very effective, sort of 90%, despite a 60% report in Brazil. But Brazil, I think the vaccine was very, very politicized, and also their method of counting was completely different. So they were counting, they counted asymptomatic infections as not protected, where I think in the UK we count asymptomatic, and we do not count asymptomatic infections. Apologies.
Yeah, so that's kind of the issue with different surveys from different countries with different control groups, etc. Like it's very hard to compare them all.
I think in Indonesia it was about 90%.
What about this other thing that's become very controversial and has come back again in terms of the lab leaks? Because that has very much confused me. I guess in the beginning, the reason why it would be very much like a propaganda thing is the idea that it not only leaked from labs, not that it leaked from labs accidentally, but on purpose. I think so. That's the part that would be like a weaponization of that theory. But now the theory that's coming up again and is more sort of acceptable in the US and stuff, it includes US complicity. So I just wonder if you have any insight into that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert on the coronavirus. I do listen to scientists, and I think, the World Health Organization have done an investigation in China on the origins of the coronavirus, and they say it's extremely unlikely that this what I would say is a conspiracy theory from the United States around it coming from a Wuhan lab is that they're saying it's extremely unlikely. And I mean, it's the politicization of this. So the US intelligence services, well, we'll come on to that in a second. They want to investigate this now. The World Health Organization is not good enough for the US intelligence agencies. Well, I mean, how we have a memory that can go back 20 years, and we know the role of Western intelligence agencies when it comes to certain investigations ahead of wars like the war in Iraq and things like, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, and rejecting UN investigations and things like that. So I think, you have to be extremely skeptical of these conspiracy theories, and there's no evidence at the moment at all of this. So I think, and we should listen to the scientific community on that. But again, there's just a barrage of attacks that come through. And in this situation, I think it's an attack on science. Yeah.
The burden of proof, of course, and it's very interesting the way that people kind of defend these distortions, and they say, well, prove that it didn't come from here, or prove that a million people in Xinjiang are not being interned. And people forget that the burden of proof should not be in the negative. If you are making the accusation, you need to prove it. And let's look at the 1 million figure for the Xinjiang internment. And then when you click a blue link through to the piece of research that it's based on, you'll see that it's based on 8 interviews of Uyghur people in Xinjiang, saying that they believe 10% of their village has been taken to a re-education school, or whatever they would like to call it. And that number is averaged out at about 10% or thereabouts, and multiplied by the population of Xinjiang, by the Uyghur population of Xinjiang, to reach 1 million. And as someone who is an analyst in my day job, I just find this absolutely ridiculous. And to see a bill bandied about in Parliament based on that piece of research really, really disturbs me. And that's kind of why I like to come back to this thing of burden of proof. And also I do hesitate to defend China, because I just feel that it's enough to just criticize the so-called evidence that people are looking at. I mean, I don't want to have to prove that China's a good country. I just want to look at these things that you're putting before Parliament and say, what are these numbers, So I don't actually always think it's necessary to prove that a country is good or bad in order to oppose a hawkish narrative peddled by our governments and by the US.
Yeah, the Xinjiang thing seems like the most effectively used one in the US, at least. Like, I guess prior to COVID, I mean, or even now, actually, but you just can't say China without saying genocide in the US. Like, you have to say it in the same, even if you're talking about Mulan, the Disney movie, somehow you have to put in that it was made in a genocidal region of China. But I don't, that's the part that I do, how do we push back on? Because there's so much silence around genocide. Like once you say genocide, now, you know, you're in this very scary position of people being like, you a genocide denier? And, you know, so how do we push back on something like that?
Well, there are figures that have, you know, like you say, sort of debunking the research in inverted commas by people like Adrian Zenz and other, you know, far right extremists essentially who believe they're on a mission from God to the Communist Party of China. And there's very mainstream figures that have questioned this. The UN advisor Jeffrey Sachs, who's an academic in the United States, and he's done a really good article saying, you know, there's no evidence at all of a genocide in China. So you need to, you know, what is this based on? And actually, the government data from China shows that the population of Uyghurs in Xinjiang has increased. And, you know, facts, I think you have to have a very facts-based discussion because, you know, the accusation of genocide, this is very serious. This is a very serious accusation, obviously. If the population is increasing, if there's 24,000 mosques in a region, which is the case in Xinjiang, you have to, you know, when the government doesn't apply a one-child policy to ethnic minority communities, and that has meant that ethnic minority communities have grown at a faster rate than the Han population, I think it's very important that we base these discussions on facts. I think it's also very important to remember that, you know, the United States is engaged in huge aggression against China. It has to justify this in some way. It has to justify spending £700 billion on a military buildup a year. It has to justify 400 military bases. It has to justify all of the high-tech weaponry it's using to surround China, all of the warships it's sending through the coastline of the South China Sea. So I think you have to really return to this point I said before of the first casualty of war is the truth. And that's the key issue. You know, I mean, they're trying to soften up public opinion for these things. And I think, you know, we have to listen to people who, you know, have got a lot of credibility, like Jeffrey Sachs and stuff, when they're saying, well, where's the evidence here? You know, and yeah, that's what I think we need to return to.
So going back to that anti-war idea, the anti-war sentiment in the UK and the US, it's something I'm very interested in because, I mean, it's something like, I just can't imagine that we're the only ones who are anti-war, but yet the movement has collapsed completely, it seems, at least. Do you have any insight into that, or do you think that I'm just being hyperbolic?
Yeah, well, what do you mean? Yeah, if you could expand on that a little bit, it'd be useful.
I guess, like, during the Iraq War, the weapons of mass destruction, you know, it came out that it was false, and that and we had loads of protests on the street, and there was just more of an awareness around that. Fast forward to the Syria war, I think Aaron Mate from the Grey Zone is the only journalist that is covering that the chemical attacks were that the chemical attacks as chlorine were staged or fabricated. Everyone else has done a complete blackout on that topic. And so the Syrian war is just, you know, it's the same scenario, but now there's no coverage of it. And now with the ramping up of, well, the no Cold War against China, well, the Cold War against China, like you're saying, from what you're saying, it just sounds like this is leading to a hot war. So, and yet there's like really not that much pushback again.
It seems like the progressive left are generally preoccupied with issues surrounding identity, which me and Ileana often sort of disagree about as a queer person of color. I don't see those issues as diametrically opposed. In fact, I feel that my experience has led me to become more suspicious of mainstream narratives. But the fact that the left only cares about issues the left only seems to focus on issues of identity in the domestic sphere, such as racial justice and LGBTQ rights, which is fantastic, but does not seem to oppose US foreign policy in any way, concerns me. And I personally don't see them as diametrically opposed. I see them as complementary, and understand that the struggles of the global South are interconnected and are also interconnected with the racism that exists in the United States and the UK. And that's kind of why we're here as Malaysians. And that's why Jamaicans are here, and that's what people of Jamaican origin are here, and Indian origin are here. So, I mean, I'm seeing that this is all interconnected, but frustrated that the other people who I think should be in the same boat as me are not seeing that.
Well, I think that we've got to look at things internationally, like in countries like Britain and the US. You know, we recently had the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn, who's a major anti-war figure, who were leading the Labour Party. We had the defeat of Bernie Sanders, who has taken positions against war in the US as well. So I think that's been a defeat. And, you know, in Britain, we have a very right-wing government, and things are going backwards. You know, I think we've discussed that there's huge attacks on people. You know, 150,000 people are being killed by the coronavirus in Britain. This is a huge defeat for people. Racism's on the rise. You know, not enough has been done on climate change. But if you look internationally, there are sort of signs of hope. I mean, I mentioned earlier the coup in Bolivia, the US-backed coup in Bolivia was overturned. And that was overturned by, you know, a huge struggle of the social movements, of indigenous peoples. They defeated a US coup. You know, that was phenomenal. And Luis Arce is now the president and pursuing, you know, mutually beneficial relations with China to develop the country. In Brazil, the situation, you know, is catastrophic. There's huge protests taking place against Bolsonaro. And so in certain places in the world, there is a movement. And look at what happened recently in Palestine, the resistance of the Palestinian people, and huge protests across the world in solidarity. So and that happened in the United States. I think possibly the biggest protest there have been in solidarity with Palestine. So it's not like there's no pushback. It's just very difficult in countries in the US and in Europe. And I think at the moment, people are waking up to the fact that there is a Cold War against China. This isn't, you know, this is in people's consciousness a relatively new development, and we're seeing the emergence of a new movement, but it's very much at the beginning. And I think the issue on a hot war is there's a threat of a hot war. You know, I wouldn't want to suggest that that's inevitable. That would be catastrophic for humanity. It would be horrific, especially if such a conflict between the US and China directly, two nuclear armed states. So we want to avoid that completely. But I think what's concerning and what's leading to more people waking up to the situation is that it wasn't just Trump, a sort of a Trump special thing that he wants to attack China like some sort of maverick. This is a position of the United States administration. This position of, you know, it's a consensus position within the ruling class in the United States to, you know, to try and hold back China and its development and its rise. And obviously, out of the pandemic, one of the key things has been that China has actually defeated the coronavirus, and they've got this economic growth, and the IMF projects that this year they're going to be responsible for 60% of growth in the world. So that means that the issue of trying to contain China from the US point of view becomes a more important thing for them to focus on. So I think, in a sense, the more dangerous the situation gets, the more that you're going to see a response from an anti-war movement in places like the United States and in Britain.
We have just a few more minutes left, and just before we head off, unless you have any questions, Wei, I was going to switch.
I was just going to go to the "what can we do" question. Really.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's something that I do want to ask you. And maybe coupled with the idea of how did you get to, for you personally, how did you sort of come to be involved in the No Cold War campaign? And if you could talk a little bit about your activism, and maybe in that way that can sort of help us figure out how do we help as well.
Yeah, well, I think that the thing that first politicized me, it was the fight in the global south for the right to self-determination, against war and occupation. So specifically the social progress that was achieved in Latin America, particularly Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez's defeat of the US coup that there was in 2002. And then at the same time, the struggle of the Palestinians, particularly in response to the war on Gaza in 2008, 2009. That kind of what inspired me to get involved in politics and activism. So I've definitely been very involved in the anti-war movement for some time. And yeah, the No Cold War campaign sort of emerged out of a whole range of international discussions. The launch meeting involved, speakers from over half a dozen countries. We had the launch statement, which is what the campaign is based on, has been translated into 18 languages, and it involves the anti-war movement, progressive forces in the global south, intellectuals. I guess my journey did start with opposing wars and in solidarity with countries in Latin America opposing coups and US intervention.
Cool, thanks. So what do we do?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that the fact that this discussion, this having these sorts of discussions in itself, I think you both referred to the kind of huge bias that there is in the mainstream media, the lack of information, and I think we're really at a point where we need to build more awareness about what's happening in the world, and establish as a mainstream point of view that a Cold War is a threat to all humanity, because that is the truth. And more people need to understand that and grasp that and understand that China isn't the enemy. China isn't a threat. What is a threat is the attacks on China. They affect every single human being in this planet too, from the point of view of whether or not you want, good 5G on your mobile phone, to whether or not you want climate change to be solved rather than sending warships to the South China Sea. So really building an understanding amongst people is a crucial thing, and No Cold War, that's what we're aiming to do. Like you said, we recently launched No Cold War Britain. There's the international campaign, and we're hoping to have a lot more webinars and events, discussions. We are opposing Britain sending its aircraft carrier to the South China Sea, which is on its way as we speak, and I think we need to be alert to the dangers of that. We are campaigning to say, stop spending billions of pounds on the military. We need to be dedicating these resources to the pandemic, to climate change. So I think campaigning on these sorts of issues is really important. If people haven't already done so, you can sign the international statement on the No Cold War website, which is on www.nocoldwar.org. And the statement is called A New Cold War Against China is Against the Interests of Humanity. It's available in 18 languages. So we're trying to build a coalition internationally against the Cold War, and there's lots of work to do in each individual country. And in Britain, the other issues, as well as the military buildup, the waste of resources involved, economic damage that we're getting from not cooperating economically with China, is also the demonization of China is leading to a huge increase in racism and hate crime. And I know you both know a lot about this issue, and that's got to be an important part of our campaigning too.
Great. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you would like to say before we sign off?
No, I think it's been a really great conversation. I'm just really grateful that you have you both here discussing with me. It's been really great.
Thank you so much for coming.
How do you think we did on that interview?
It was, look, Fiona's such an amazing speaker and she just knows so much. So I was just in awe. So yeah, she knows what she's saying, and I wanted to hear everything that she said. So And she did also try and get a bit out of us and talk about how our identity and background kind of intersect with this conversation. So I found it great, but wish it could have gone on for one more hour.
Yeah, there's a lot to
Mhm.
cover there. And actually, she does have some of her articles up on her website, Eyes on Latin America. We'll link to everything because there's just so much more information, you know, that we couldn't cover. And also we'll link to the No Cold War website. But just, it does make me realize, like, there's too much to know. There's like so many countries to cover. That's the thing. And the agenda, the imperialist agenda, it's kind of fascinating how big the reach is when I think about it. You know, it just covers so much of the world. So yeah, so there's that. And also the spiel of, we should do a spiel of, if you like our videos, you can actually like our videos. Actually, you can actually tangibly like our videos. You can press the thumbs up thing on YouTube. That apparently helps. I hear from other people that helps. You've been listening to the Ignoramus's Guide to Surviving Humanity. You can like our videos on YouTube and subscribe. And also we are available in Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, and Patreon. If you want to help us grow, then please become a patron on Patreon. We're also on Instagram at the Ignoramus Guide.
You can just edit that smoother.
Also, we're on Twitter. We're also on Twitter.
Twitter.